What is a debt, anyway, asks David Graeber at the end of his book on that topic. It's just, quote, the perversion of a promise, unquote. Now, of course, we know from Nietzsche's genealogy of morals that even the promise itself is already a perversion of the free existence of a less willful creature than what we become, an animal with the right to make promises. Graeber goes on to name some of those rights, departing from Nietzsche a bit. Let's see if that works. Okay. And here's Graeber. If freedom, real freedom, is the ability to make friends, then it is also necessarily the ability to make real promises. What sort of promises might genuinely free women and men make to one another, Graeber asks, suggesting that such men and women might promise to let go their debts and begin anew. For Graeber, that is, debt forgiveness is the moral response to a current moral masquerade, that is, the immoral perversion of promising, that is, debt. This is how Graeber ends his book, with these thoughts and with what he calls, quote, a concrete proposal. Now, no one who really thinks in terms of concrete proposals would recognize his proposal as such. But in American politics, there's something called a wish bill, and that is a bit of utopian legislation that might nudge the realists out of their ruts. And this is how I see Graeber's concrete proposal. We are, quote, he says, long overdue for some kind of biblical-style jubilee. Now, jubilee means universal debt forgiveness or release, as in I release you, the debtor can say to the indebted. Jubilee would not only, on Graeber's account, alleviate suffering, it would also, he reminds us, or it is also, he reminds us, a reminder, quote, that paying one's debts is not the essence of morality. In the Bible, though, Jubilee is also part of an infrastructure of equality oriented towards rehearsal, remediation, and repair. And this is absent from Graeber, and it's one of the reasons I want to share this material with you today. The moralization of debt, to which Graeber objects, is, of course, tracked by Nietzsche in the genealogy of morals, in which debt relations are deepened and interiorized to create the responsible, self-castigating moral subject of free will. This contingent past can perhaps be overcome, is Graeber's suggestion. Morality need not consist in the principle of debt payment. There may, he suggests, be other moralities to come, effectively claiming that it is not too late for such a transvaluation of values. Graeber is here more a bit Nietzschean, than he allows. Something like that transvaluation may already be found in the work of Hannah Arendt. Indeed, Graeber's conclusion, which links promising, the freedom to make promises, and forgiveness, jubilee is debt forgiveness, resonates with Arendt's The Human Condition. She too is impressed by the power of men and women to make promises to each other. It's part of the awesome political power to begin anew when we act together in concert. This is well known, Arendt's interest in promising. Less often noted is Arendt's equal emphasis on the importance of forgiveness to shared political life. Her term for forgiveness is, quote, constant mutual release, unquote. Not for her the soul-searching sincerities or penance that moralized forgiveness requires. Instead, Arendt sees promising as binding into a future and forgiveness as simple release from the past. It's a very Nietzschean view of forgiveness, pre-moralized, non-moraline, he might have said. In her book, The Human Condition, Arendt distinguishes three domains of the active human life: labor, the cyclical biological life; work, the domain of fabrication; and action. I won't summarize or rehearse the argument here. I just want to point out one detail. Unlike labor, which is caught in circularity that only work can interrupt, and unlike work, which depends on the external gifts of action to bestow meaning upon the world that work stabilizes, Arendtian action provides its own autonomous responses to its own specific insufficiencies. It's the only one of the three that has that quality. Action's predicament Action's predicament is that it is both irreversible and unpredictable. So you have it there, the irreversibility and unpredictability of the process started by acting does not arise out of another, possibly higher faculty, Arendt says, but is rather one of the potentialities of action itself. In other words, that it can go wrong. That's one of its potentialities. The possible redemption from the predicament of irreversibility, of being unable to undo what one has done, though one did not and could not have known what he was doing, is the faculty of forgiving. The remedy for unpredictability, for the chaotic uncertainty of the future, is contained in the faculty to make and keep promises, she says. Now, redemption, her term, as Graeber points out, not talking about her, as Graeber points out, redemption is a debt word. But Arendt here uses it in connection with forgiving, which she understands in that Jubilee sense of release, releasing a hold on someone's life. Similarly, Arendt treats promising not as a debt-making practice, but as a collective practice of world-making that is not reducible or even translatable to debt. These are some of the reasons that I've increasingly come to think of Arendt as a Sabbatarian thinker. Jubilee is called in the Hebrew Bible the Sabbath of Sabbaths. So when I say Sabbatarian, I mean in that very expansive sense to include Jubilee. There are other reasons as well for thinking of her that way. Arendt is famously critical of use, and her critique resonates with the Judaic weekly Sabbath, which in its command to rest on every seventh day seeks to put use in its place. This is precisely what Arendt does in the human condition when she restricts use to the domain of work. Also, her critique elsewhere of the politics of territoriality resonates with the Judaic land sabbatical, which commands that land be released from productivity, and it too is allowed to rest, every 7 years in this case. We can see this land sabbatical requirement as a strictly agricultural practice, which it was, but it was also a redistributive practice. The fallow sabbatical year was also a year in which whatever happened to grow in the sabbatical fields was left for the poor to glean. Land sabbatical means that private land becomes a commons every 7 years, for a year. The gleaners go from what they have every year, which is a permitted corner of an owned sovereign field, to be allowed and invited to occupy the whole of the field. So we have the weekly sabbatical, which is an interruption of use, the every 7 years land sabbatical, which interrupts private property with a commons of gleaners, and Jubilee, the Sabbath of Sabbaths, and its requirement of debt release or debt forgiveness or slave emancipation. And this happens every 7 times 7 years on the 49th or the 50th year and is called Jubilee. In the Hebrew Bible, all three are about equality. All three interrupt or supplement the economy of debt, which they also uphold. The 3 Sabbaths are periodic equalizers that both restart the human race, but also perhaps extend the life of the race. If we treat Jubilee as 1/3 of a braided practice of equality in the Hebrew Bible, including the weekly Sabbath, the septennial land sabbatical, and the Jubilee of Emancipation altogether, then in their connection we find something more astute for our own time than Graeber's Jubilee of the clean slate legislation, which is borrowed from different ancient sources than the ones I'm referring to here. The braided 3 also offer something more tuned in to the operativities of injustice than does the Sabbath of inoperativity that we get from Agamben, who suggests that man is a sabbatical animal, but does not connect that Sabbath animality to land sabbatical or to Jubilee. So I'm going to look at a few, that was the conclusion, I turned it into my introduction, because I didn't want to miss any of that. I'm going to look now at a few different treatments of Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, and I'm going to show their connections to Arendt's thought. But I want up front first to mention a very serious concern that I have, that in talking about debt forgiveness or release, at a moment when we are also suddenly hearing serious talk in the public sphere about reparations, finally, in particular for slavery, is nervous-making to me, and I want to say that no matter how attractive the idea of Jubilee is in the context of a debt economy, and I would say it's extremely attractive in that context, we must not ignore the issue of this timing. I feel a little bit like Patricia Williams writing in the mid-'80s in The Alchemy of Race and Rights about the critique of the subject, and writing from the perspective of African Americans saying, but we just got the subject. We don't want to critique it yet. We would like to enjoy it for a while. And I have her voice in my head when I'm thinking about this. We must not ignore the issue of this timing. Jubilee cannot come at the cost of reparations, a debt whose payment is long overdue for slavery and for imperial extractivism more generally. I will note, therefore, now that among the many and contradictory rules for manumission in the Hebrew Bible are the following requirement. There are many requirements. I'm picking the good ones. So this is one, and that is when you set him free, do not let him go empty-handed. Furnish him out of the flock, the threshing floor, and that with which the Lord your God has blessed you. In other words, something is owed beyond just manumission or emancipation. Okay, so the paper looks at 3 efforts in philosophy and theology to enlist the weekly Sabbath to offset the hegemony of use in the 24/7 temporality of modern life. And here's one example of such a use. I think it's small and you can't read it, and if that's true, I apologize, but it doesn't really matter. It's just a random example of how Sabbath is everywhere these days. Here's what does matter. Okay. The 3 enlistments of Sabbath are Giorgio Agamben's Sabbath of Inoperativity, Franz Rosenzweig's Sabbath of Creation, and A.J. Heschel's Sabbath of Eternity. These are 3 different accounts of that weekly Sabbath, commonly thought of as the day of rest. They treat it as more than the mere day of rest. And to these 3, I'm going to add another called the Sabbath of Equality, which is what Sabbath looks like when we link the weekly Sabbath to the biblically enjoined land and debt sabbaticals that I've just described to you of every 7 and 49 years. Here, just so you understand why I'm thinking of Arendt as a Sabbatarian thinker, Arendtian action brings together all of the Sabbath traits looked at here. Arendtian action is non-instrumental, like Agamben's inoperativity. It's natal or inaugural, like Rosenzweig's creation. And it's immortal, like Heschel's eternity, and marked by equality, like the Sabbath of equality that I'll develop here. I do not claim that Arendt drew on Sabbath for her account of action, though she may have, because I'm told by someone who should know that she read Rosenzweig in the 1920s, but I haven't checked that out for myself yet. Rather, what draws my 3 thinkers and me to Sabbath is what drew Arendt to theorize action as she did. That would be the claim. Also, putting these different accounts of Sabbath alongside each other with Arendt opens up a new way to think about some old criticisms of Arendt, specifically that her politics has no purpose. So we get to think about what it means to have a non-purposive politics from the perspective of inoperativity or the Sabbath critique of use, rather than from the perspective of some old debates about aestheticized politics, which is the old criticism of her. Okay, Agamben. I have to say I've stripped this down so that I can tell it all to you in a half an hour, so that's what's going to happen. Okay, so we're going to go through Agamben a little quickly, but I kind of assumed you guys would know him. So Giorgio Agamben's treatment of Sabbath fits with his more general project, which is to draw inoperativity out of its sacralized locations and deploy its newly profanated powers to undo the hegemony of use in our 24/7 societies. Inoperativity undoes late modernity's rampant utilitarianization of use, Agamben says. Now, Sabbath is just one in a long list of instances of inoperativity that Agamben provides. Others are, as you all know, feast, scholarship, contemplation, glory, leisure, worship, dance, general strike, bulimia, anorexia, and many more. It's a far-flung list. All of them are in some way anti-productive. That's what's key to him. But Sabbath stands out from this list because, at least in Nudities, it solves, one of his books, it solves a problem for him. So he says the repose, is this on the next page? I have no idea what happened here. Yes, okay. So he says the repose of the Sabbath is not a simple abstention from prohibitive activities. It actually involves doing some quotidian things differently. On the Sabbath, he says, the entire sphere of licit behaviors and activities, in other words, those still permitted, instead of focusing, in other words, as people do on what you're not allowed to do on Sabbath, he focuses on the licit activities that you are allowed to do, and on the fact that they're invested with what he calls that indefinable emotional tonality that we call festiveness, right? So we do ordinary things, but we do them in a non-use way, or we do use things in a non-use way. So by contrast with the everyday, if one eats on the Sabbath, it's not done for the sake of being fed. If one gets dressed, it's not done for the sake of being covered up, and so on. So I'll just let you read that list. Okay. So unlike other sacralizations of inoperativity, which include the glorious body in nudities, for example, Sabbath's aim is not to render certain activities sacred and untouchable, but on the contrary, to open them to a new or more ancient possible use in the spirit of the Sabbath, he says, in nudities. And in nudities, this is what differentiates Sabbath from glory, because glory does hive things off into a sacred zone where they're supposed to be untouchable. That's the sacralization. So in nudities, this is what differentiates Sabbath from glory, and I think it's also why Agamben turns to Sabbath in the Hunger of an Ox chapter after the chapter on the glorious body. So here's why. Although Agamben says that, quote, glory is in a sense in solidarity with inoperativity, it's also the case that glory solidarity is a bit of a mixed blessing. Glory illustrates or instances operativity, taking something sacred and inoperative like the body of Christ after resurrection, so you can see it, it exhibits it ostensibly, but it also aborts it by preventing or blocking the new use on behalf of which Agamben claims inoperativity as such. And this is a problem for Agamben in nudities. Glory, he says, is nothing other than the separation of inoperativity into a special sphere, that of worship or liturgy. In this way, what was merely a threshold that granted access to a new use is transformed into a permanent condition. Permanent condition, then how do we release it? This is the problem. Glory isolates inoperativity, thereby preserving but also canceling it, as far as new use is concerned. Sabbath, by contrast, offers a sacralized interruption of the everyday, doing ordinary things with festive tonality, which makes inoperativity something other than ostensive. Like when it's sacred, it's just something you can point to or talk about, but not use. So it points to a way out of that trap of glory. But, and here's the problem, Sabbath also comes with, and this is not Agamben, now this is me, comes with an equality demand that requires commensuration, compensation, remediation, and not just inoperativity. So I'm going to move very quickly through the Sabbath of equality. You know most of it already from the 3 Sabbaths that I outlined at the beginning. So here's what I mean when I say it has an equality demand. The function of all 3 Sabbaths in the Hebrew Bible is to address or alleviate the miseries of inequality, and not just by way of charity or hospitality, but by way of an infrastructure that restores equality periodically or reminds us of it in a palpable way, which is why I sometimes refer to that infrastructure as an infrastructure of rehearsal. The Sabbath of equality is more fundamentally committed to equality than to inoperativity, if we had to pick, I'm saying, because inoperativity's purity may thwart the ambitious redistributions of the 3 Sabbaths. Equality postulates both operativity and inoperativity, both the strike and the general strike, both technologies of redistribution and the suspension of all commensurating technologies. That is to say, equality is not reducible to the anti-use or post-use ideal that orients Agamben's project. Now, we can see this also by way of Franz Rosenzweig and his treatment of the count in the holiday cycle. There's a much longer discussion of everything in the paper, so I'm just going to press on. Okay, are we good? Everybody good? Okay. Okay, me too. So, for Rosenzweig, Sabbath, for Rosenzweig calls Sabbath the Sabbath of creation, as I mentioned at the beginning. For him, Sabbath is one of three nodal points around which the Jewish calendrical cycle is organized. By the way, during the part on Rosenzweig, I might sound a little crazy, and that's because I'm channeling Rosenzweig. I'm just gonna say that. I'm just channeling him. None of these three nodal points of Sabbath are none of them is the Sabbath of equality, just to let you know. In Rosenzweig, the weekly Sabbath is the first in a series that consists of creation, revelation, and redemption. As you see there, creation is represented by Sabbath, and he's only talking about the weekly Sabbath. He doesn't talk about the other two that I braid into the same concept, borrowing from the Hebrew Bible. So creation is represented by the Sabbath, revelation is represented by the Jewish holiday cycle, which involves Passover, Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks, and Sukkot, the Feast of the Tabernacles. And you'll notice there are three there too, and I'm going to come back to that threeness. And then the third in the cycle of the larger cycle is redemption, which is represented by the days of Awe, Yom Kippur. So Sabbath is 1/3 of this cycle under creation, but it isn't just that, even in Rosenzweig, because he says that Sabbath also carries moments of all three of these within itself. We mark creation on the Friday evening of the Sabbath, revelation on the Saturday morning, and redemption in the afternoon. So it's kind of like there's a macro and a micro version of the threes. And he does this through a reading of the liturgy that you would go through in the synagogue. So there's a whole reading that goes with this. Okay. So like the three Sabbaths, Rosenzweig's series of three is also oriented to equality. I have to skip the details, but I just want to make that clear. There's an orientation towards equality in Rosenzweig, and both the three Sabbaths and his series also involve counting. Rosenzweig notes that on the Sabbath, quote, so this is the first part, the equality part, even servant and maid must rest, indeed precisely for the sake of their rest, it is written the day of rest is instituted, so that's his equality claim. And second, counting is an important feature both of the Rosenzweigian holiday cycle of revelation, that middle one with the Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, and of the Sabbath sabbatical Jubilee cycle. In the case of the sabbaticals, the Israelites are told to count the years from 1 to 49 to mark the land and debt sabbaticals every 7th and 49th year, and this is called counting the Yovel or Jubilee. And there you can read the you shall count, which is, I think, from Leviticus. Now, what's important for me is that in Rosenzweig's revelation holiday cycle, the three in the middle, which also consists of three, we also depend on the count. We count the days between Passover and Shavuot, that's 2/3 of the revelation cycle, and this is called counting the Omer. And the number of Omer days that need to be counted is, does anybody know? 49, 7 times 7. It's the same as the number of years to Jubilee, which is called the Sabbath of Sabbaths. In the Revelation cycle, we count the Omer to 50 days and arrive at Shavuot, which celebrates the giving of the law. In the Sabbath cycle, we count the Yovel or Jubilee to 50 years and arrive at Jubilee, which restores the condition of that law's reception, which is equality. In the 50th year, slaves and indentured servants are freed and land is redistributed. Jubilee is a correction, then, of the accretion in time of the kinds of inequality that are laws undoing. It is, in Republican terms for political theorists, a return to beginning. But how should we read the commandment to count? The practice took the place of calendars, I suppose, once upon a time, because if you didn't count, how would you know when you got there? But why is there a command for everyone to count as a community? It's possible the counting works like a hypnotist's recitation of numbers and puts us all under a spell, the spell of the cycle of the Sabbath, or also, perhaps, the practice of communitarian counting is itself an egalitarian mechanism. Without a public, shared count, the days of redistribution and emancipation might never come. Elites might forget to count. They might neglect the count. They know, after all, what it portends. Or they might accidentally lose track of it. The count is the structure of equality, a practice of accountability, a mechanism of self-governance, a kind of anarchist calisthenics, to borrow from James Scott, a liturgical commitment, and an insurance scheme. It's all of those things at once. It could be other things too. I'm open to further suggestions. What's key for me, I think, in my conversation with Agamben is the count is both operative and inoperative. Okay. Still good? Okay. On to Heschel. Heschel wrote a book called The Sabbath, so it is mandatory that we discuss Heschel. His project in that book was to write a book about the Sabbath for a secular American audience keen on assimilation in the middle of the 20th century, and yet he did not secularize Sabbath. He insisted that Sabbath belonged to the temporality of eternity. He called it a tent of time. And I want to say that without necessarily signing on to his theology any more than we did to Rosenzweig's, we can have some appreciation for what he offers. For Heschel, Sabbath is the weekly expression of a distinct temporality that runs at cross purposes to secular time. He has this great quote, on the Sabbath, the hours do not oust each other. I love that. I've been feeling very ousted lately. Sabbath denaturalizes secular linear time and turns it into a contestable thing, making possible the sort of clash that, to my mind, often seems to be missing from Agamben's inoperativity theory, which is more absorbent than conflictual. Now, secularists may balk at Heschel's notion of sacred time, in which, quote, time is an otherness, but even non-believers may find the idea of a non-sequential, non-punctual time welcome in the context of the 24/7 tyranny of punctuality, which reduces time to measurement and dispenses precisely with the count that could disrupt it. Heschel is at his most poetic when writing about the powerful pull to transform time into space, a spell that captivates most of us. And here's one of his passages on that. And I was thinking of this yesterday as we were talking about time and space as well. I think he's an important contributor to that conversation of how we convert them. And he is thinking about thingness and thinginess and the attractions of those things, but without using the language of commodity fetishism. But it's the same, seems to me anyway, to be very much the same idea. You'll notice that the passage that you're reading ends with the phrase jubilees of frustration. I've already told you that none of these thinkers talks about Sabbath in connection with the other two Sabbaths, the way that I'm suggesting we should, land sabbatical and jubilee. But I take that term showing up here in an unusual way to be, as they would say in the world of gambling, a tell. Heschel is not thinking of ancient Judaism's requirement of slave emancipation every 50 years, but the appearance of that term, jubilee, may be significant because jubilee does what Heschel wants. It subjects space to eternal time. Every 7 years, your propertied land must lie fallow. Every 49 years on the jubilee, debt slaves must be emancipated. In these septennial Sabbaths, property, a thing, meets time, and eternal time wins. Human sovereignty is suspended, and some new use in common, oriented towards equality, takes its place. Heschel says there's a realm of time where the goal is not to have, but to be, not to own, but to give, not to control, but to share, not to subdue, but to be in accord. Now, Heschel ends his book reflecting on the creative and inaugural powers obscured by our paradigm of secular sequential time. And in so doing, he calls to mind Hannah Arendt's account of action, which also has its own temporality, that of immortality in the human condition. But what Arendt de-theologizes, Heschel re-theologizes. Time is God's gift to the world of space, he says. Now, this could be a coded restatement of Arendt's view of action, whose time of immortality creates the unique space of the political, in which, as Heschel says of the Sabbath, quote, every instant is an act of creation, a beginning, unquote. When Heschel goes on to say that, quote, we cannot solve the problem of time, which is to say that secular time fills us with dread as it appears to pass ceaselessly and thus escapes our grasp, so we can't solve that problem through the conquest of space, through either pyramids or fame, he recalls Arendt's occasional critiques of work as a kind of idolatry. The products of work are necessary to underwrite action, but cannot and must not take its place, she says. Their object permanence is a false solace. Okay, so in these quotes from Agamben, we see that Agamben is aware that a misreading of inoperativity as mere purposelessness might lead to a confusion of ethics and aesthetics. And this is what happened to Hannah Arendt, who was criticized in the 70s, 80s, and 90s for theorizing a politics that was empty. Critics argued that it was entirely unclear what Arendtian political actors were supposed to do. Prohibited from politicizing labor and work, what was left? Empty posturing, they claimed, mere display, the ostension of Agamben perhaps, exhibitionism, glory, her critics said, all rejecting the view. Rereading Arendt now with Agamben, it seems that those critics were responding to a thread, perhaps also a threat, of inoperativity in her work, born of her concern to render inoperative the hegemony of use on behalf of something like new use, as Agamben now calls it. What is Arendtian action, after all, if not new use? A new use of the laboring and working body rendered inoperative for labor and work and oriented to the inaugural, the creative, the new, as Arendt herself puts it, the pleasurable, the joyful, the natal, the festive, as she says. Reading Arendt with Agamben highlights the inoperativity dimensions of her project. The irrelevance of life concerns to Arendtian politics was not recognizable to an earlier generation of critics as a virtue of what we now call inoperativity and as a critique of biopolitics. Now that would be just an uncontroversial explanation of the choices she made. Back then it looked like she was abdicating responsibility for equality. What looked to earlier critics like an absence of purpose can now be seen rather as a purposeful counter to use. This is not to reduce Arendt's project to Agamben's, however. As I've noted, Agamben's inoperativity, unlike Arendtian action, has no exigency for equality. That exigency is pressed upon him by his own turn to Sabbath, which, though he doesn't note it, is marked by the clean slate legislations and the commons that appear in the Hebrew Bible, respectively, as Jubilee and Shemitah, Jubilee and land sabbatical, which we must count on. Sabbath, the day of rest, like that digital Sabbath that I put up for you. I'm sorry, I missed a line. That we must count on or inaugurate for ourselves. In so doing, we correct for the focus now only on the one Sabbath. The day of rest is the only Sabbath we ever hear about, which is like that digital Sabbath, and not on the days and years of redistribution, correction, and emancipation that the other two strands offer. The connections among them, the fact that they share the name of the Sabbath, suggest that we cannot have the rest of the weekly Sabbath without the corrections of the other two. And this is why, for all his efforts, Heschel could not in the end sell the Sabbath to the 20th century, not just because of its weirdly sacred eternity, but because of what it underwrites, which is to say equality, equality being the bigger hurdle, bigger even than the idolatry of things. My last sentences. Sabbath can be the frame. This is my conclusion, my new conclusion, because I gave you the conclusion up front. Sabbath can be the frame not only of Judaic Saturdays or Christian Sundays or Muslim Fridays, but also of other not necessarily theological commitments to stop business as usual, alter it, undo its accreted injustices, and rehearse equality so that we don't forget what it feels and looks like. In North Carolina, the Reverend Barber's weekly Moral Mondays may well be an example of Sabbath so understood, a creative interruption of the everyday, illuminated by a distinctive temporality, nobody likes Mondays, and oriented to equality. I'd also add that in his book, Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates turns Jubilee into a mode of implotment, when he notes how some U.S. memorials of the Civil War tell the story of the fall of the American Confederacy as if it were, quote, the onset of a tragedy and not jubilee, unquote. As Arendt knows, it matters how we tell the story, for we cannot count on the world to do it for us. Coates' suggestion, then, is that we've lost count. It's time to count again toward Jubilee and the repair and reparations that Sabbath's three parts braid together for us. Thank you.